This is a history of the Star Wars, and the Galactic Federation. Part 3, 4000 BC to the 21st century AD. The last 6,000 years has been the most important time in human history. The Star Wars had raged from around 200,000 BC to 190,000 BC, and led to a long period of peace that lasted almost another 150 millennia. The Agar thence lived on the surface separate from humans of that era but enjoyed full use of Earth and left behind many signs of their presence. When Ra emerged from Saturn at around 38,000 BC, it began a new era of conflict, and there was great fear that it could lead to another round of Star Wars, such as an intergalactic civil war. Ra quickly took over Earth and maintained a constant threat to Agartha and humanity developing on Earth. The return of Ra to Earth began a crisis that the Galactic Federation had never believed would ever really come. In the near 150 millennia since the Star Wars, and L's departure for the future, many believed and knew that L would return and that it was simply a matter of the relativity of time, that to L, the journey would be as no time had passed. But as the millennia passed, many forgot, and simply no longer believed that L had intended to return, and the details of what had happened became obscured over time. L's return began a new era of resistance against Ra, as L returned at around 9000 BC, which meant Ra had dominated the surface of Earth for almost 30,000 years. He had kept the Agar thence contained within their inner world in that time, and the Federation was kept frozen in a deadlock on how to address the crisis on Earth, resulting in no overt action being taken against Ra. When L returned, he did not immediately reveal himself to the Federation, and instead immediately began taking actions against Ra. He had maintained the ability to assert his control over the Galactic Federation systems from the time he had departed, and knew he would be able to take over direct control whenever he wanted. But before that, he wanted to use the time to take out Ra and expose who within the Federation had been helping him. L revealed himself to the Terra Novans and Agar thence instead, and they helped him disable Ra's global control systems on Earth, forcing Ra back into hiding but ending his open reign on Earth. L maintained a watch over Earth after that, but that is when the Galactic Federation dispatched a mothership of the era, a giant cube, to chastise the Asgard, who they blamed for attacking Ra. They made it clear that they had not supported taking any action on the surface, and ordered the Asgard to refrain from returning to the surface. They issued a prime directive that put Earth under a quarantine and blockade from all forms of contact from the outside universe. The Federation Cube then made periodic patrols of Earth's system and was charged with maintaining order in this galaxy. 5,000 years passed while Ra had traveled back and forth many times from Cydonia to another Asgard transportation stone that they set up in Giza. Many of Ra's ruling class, the Aryans, had escaped Atlantis, and many were ruling over Ra's pyramid cities in various places all over the world. With El choosing to remain hidden, the Asgard agreed to remain in Agartha. El hid his city on the moon, and Ra ruled in secret over his remaining kingdoms on Earth through his Atlantean ruling class. By 4000 BC, Ra was discovered by El and he eliminated Ra's holdings on Mars. This time is actually more significant than previously understood. The Federation mothership returned and made a more severe threat against the Asgard, who they again blamed for attacking Ra on Mars. This is when El decided to continue the fight on the ground using only primitive technology, so as to avoid drawing attention from the Galactic Federation. If they could win the battle on the ground against Ra's now limited force that was also reduced to primitive technology, it could still be finished without drawing in the Federation. This is when El was openly visited in Elysium by himself, that is, a much older version of himself from the distant future. He revealed himself to the El of that time period and the city inhabitants and revealed that he had returned from hundreds of thousands of years in the future, where he had unlocked the quantum particle function and gained control of the afterlife system. That older El then revealed to his younger self that he was actually God, not Ra. From that point on, El of that era was taking orders from his elder self, who was administering the entire timeline from the distant future. The entire unfolding of humanity and El's apotheosis was all a journey an original him had designed for himself. As humanity unfolds, El rises up to return to being master of the universe when the entire process has completed. So El of that time then returned to Earth with Elysium and placed 12 cities on the surface in what we call the Levant and Iraq that became Sumeria and Akkadia. Each city started with a ziggurat or temple at the center that was placed by El as its center of control. That kingdom was called Zion. Elder El then took his younger self and sent him to Earth to lead the kingdom and destroy Ra and his kingdoms in Egypt. He took the name Adamu. Up to that point, younger El had actually still been going by the name Anaki or An. After about a century, their populations grew and Ra's kingdoms in Egypt had not discovered the rising kingdom beyond their borders. That is when Cain, Adamu's eldest son, killed his brother Abel and fled their capital city of Eridu with his personal guard and established an enclave within the Zagros and east of the Zagros mountains. He made his capital in what we now call the city of Persepolis. Adamu had been building an army, and had been helped by people from Elysium and some members of the Asgard, who became known to the people of the time as the Elohim, and later as the Watchers. This new crisis split the kingdom of Zion and created a second front in the coming war against Ra. For the time being, Adamu allowed Cain to barricade himself within the mountains while he raised his army to march into Egypt. Within a couple of years of launching his campaign into Egypt, they finally forced their defeat. The Egyptians had still also been assisted by the Atlanteans, who were also larger, taller, stronger, and had helped their slave armies maintain many advantages. Adamu also enlisted the help of local African tribes that inhabited the Upper Nile River region and Ethiopia to combine a slave rebellion against Ra's kingdom while Zion marched its troops over the Sinai and into Giza. Finally Ra fought Adamu in battle and was destroyed. The Atlanteans fled with many of their hybrid children across the Mediterranean into Europe. After that Adamu returned with his army to the east and returned to Eridu. There he camped and made preparations to march into the Zagros mountains to reign in Cain. In those years, Cain had built many strongholds and had raised an army of men from that era, forming large mobs rather than armies that began pillaging the lands and occupying many towns and cities east of the mountains. Adamu marched into the mountains and destroyed the enclave, capturing Cain and ending his rule, after a years-long war. Cain was then given the mark of Cain by Adamu and kept captive for centuries. Adamu continued to rule Zion for almost 1,000 years in total. That is when the Sphinx was built in Egypt with its original lion's head which represented El. Adamu and the Elohim had been able to maintain use of the water of life with the use of special grails that were actually quantum machines that could turn any water placed within the cup into the water of life. During those first 8 centuries, Adamu ventured around the planet and brought with him the founders of the modern civilizations we know of today that thrive in Asia and India, and made contact with Ra's former kingdoms in East Asia, Africa, and South and Central America. For a time, they were given new leadership and Adamu taught them civilization. He adventured all across the many continents, making contact with the many peoples of earth and replaced Ra worship amid these peoples with the knowledge of the truth and set them free. After 9 centuries, Zion broke up into many smaller kingdoms when populations grew out of control and societies broke up into clans ruled by warlords. War erupted and the old kingdom was consumed by conflict. Adamu, actually then withdrew into the shadows, and did not die. Cain, who had remained in custody for centuries, killed an Elohim to escape during the upheaval and stole the Elohim's Grail cup. The Elohim was able to be resuscitated, but the Grail was now lost and Cain was hiding among the people, many of whom were now beginning to openly worship Cain. In Egypt, Ra worship had also begun to return and surge, and Zion was pushed out of there as well. Cain and Ra worship spread across the land. The entire world of civilization was lost to the grip of evil forces. This is when El, using advanced technology, decided to again use a flood and raise the water levels using an artificial gravity well, and caused a deluge centered around Egypt and the Levant. Before that though, El did reach out to people like in the commonly known story of Noah's Ark, to save those who could be trusted. Other places however did have survivors, as there were those who survived on boats and in high places. The Parthenon in Athens, Greece for instance served as a temporary refuge for many in that area during the flood, as those who could, huddled atop the mountain to survive. El had hoped that this would finally end the threat from Ra and Cain, but Cain had survived and returned to hiding among people on the surface. After the flood rescinded, civilization restarted and resumed. This marked the beginning of the era we know as Dynastic Egypt. After that El maintained watch over civilization, and from time to time returned to the surface in disguise and guided the flow of civilization. Other times they overtly intervened despite the risk of drawing attention from the Federation. El used his city ship several times to bombard places like Sodom and Gomorrah, destroy the Tower of Babel, and for parting the Red Sea for Moses and the Hebrews exiting Egypt. The Atlanteans who returned to Egypt after the flood re-established a dynastic system under the worship of Ra and established the rule of the pharaohs. They built many more pyramids and began to re-enslave the nearby kingdoms. By the 14th century BC they bred Akhenaten using the last of their advanced technology from Atlantis, and engineered him to be able to be telekinetic when fully sustained by the water of life. This made him extremely dangerous. Akhenaten when grown then became Ra's host, and became a maniacal dictator that was terribly cruel to their slaves. He was bred to be a racial hybrid to appease the large populations of African slaves who threatened to rebel unless their bloodlines were worked into the royalty and were given their own local kings to govern them. El found out about Akhenaten and attempted to strike him from orbit using Elysium. In return Akhenaten surrounded himself with dozens of children at all times. In order to avoid being exposed, he ordered the construction of a massive underground fortress. It took the slaves years to build. In that time, they were helped by El's agents to hide a plan to build a cover stone over the entrance of the bunker. They knew they would have to sacrifice slaves to trap Akhenaten, and accepted losing 100 of them that had to go into the bunker with Akhenaten when it was first completed. As he inspected it with his entourage, the slaves staged a revolt on the surface and loosened a stone above the door that was covered by tapestries. Before Akhenaten could emerge, the stone, weighing many tons, slid down over the opening quickly and sealed the door. The door and stone and walls being several feet thick, even Akhenaten could not lift the stone with his telekinesis. Inside, they had placed their last fusion-powered generator that powered a synthesizer that made the water of life for them, but no food. He then used that to keep himself and some slaves alive inside the tomb for several millennia. After 400 years the Hebrew slaves were liberated by El via his chosen emissary Moses, who led the Hebrews out of Egypt after inflicting many plagues upon the Pharaoh ship. Moses led the Hebrews to Mount Sinai where El bestowed upon him the 10 Commandments, establishing the new rule of law among his people, the last of those who had continued their system of beliefs tracing back to the kingdom of Zion 2 millennia earlier. After the Hebrews left the desert they put the tablets Moses received from El in a special ark known as the Ark of the Covenant. It generated a strong umbrella of protection upon the Hebrews and they kept it for centuries, until the Babylonians finally conquered Jerusalem in the 6th century BC. During those years, the Galactic Federation had a leader who had taken interest in the happenings on Earth, called Marduk. He had come to some of the civilizations on Earth and tried to establish himself as a god-like being as well. It turned out he was also a Ra worshipper that was under Ra's influence, and they attempted to shift the balance of power in their favor again. It had been Marduk who had been behind the construction of the Tower of Babel, that El destroyed as well with Elysium, as well as having scrambled the languages of the locals in order to cause disarray within the Babylonians. After that the development of civilization unfolded as a proxy war that was also between El, Ra, Cain, and various parties from the Federation. El had been behind many of the great events that changed society and he guided civilizations as best could be done via an indirect influence. All of the wars and conflicts of the last 5,000 years have revolved around the battle for control of our long-term future, and control of the modern age. It was true that who controlled the past controlled the future, and who controlled the present controlled the past. El had been behind the rise and fall of many civilizations over the next several thousand years. In that time, new religions arose that were undoubtedly in competition to El's religions and kingdoms and were the result of the meddling of Ra's spirit, or parties from the Federation. For instance, El had been behind the rise of Greece and Rome, and also civilizations in India, China, and Japan. However, all of these areas had strong influences from Ra worshippers and the Federation. The vast majority of Hinduism relates to experiences and encounters their people had with Federation societies, but is mostly an interpretation of El and Ra's conflict, in the form of the Devas versus the Asuras, Shiva and the Ahura Mazda. Similarly, in that era we saw the rise of Zoroastrianism, which revolved around a Cain-like messianic figure that dominated for almost 1,000 years. This tactic was often used to draw people away from El's kingdoms. By the end of the Roman era, the beliefs in the old systems of gods had been predominantly progressed into monotheism and the contemplation of our metaphysical origins, as well as belief in one central entity taking the form of God. By this point, younger El had known that his elder self was also there in places having unseen influence, and was competing with Ra over the lives of mortals. This culminated in the reoccurrence of the Messiah within the Hebrews, with El coming and using Genesis-level power to be reborn within the mortal world. It was the challenges to El as the Christ that forfeit his life in the challenge with Ra, and it became inevitable that he would be forced to give his life to prove his depth and uphold that God's side is the stronger and more deserving in order for the challenge and the battle to continue. The following Christianization of the Roman Empire became a major victory for El over Ra. However, in return, Ra responded by reforming his failing Zoroastrianism into what became known as Islam, established a new messianic figure, and began breathing strength into that movement to compete with the rise and rapid spread of Christianity. The last of the original Hebrews from Zion that still lived in the Levant then often found themselves caught between both sides. However, it became evident during the Crusades era of the 11th and 12th centuries that Islam had become a major threat to all of El's kingdoms, and had essentially been grown to compete with and eventually cancel out El's civilizations. This resulted in almost a millennia of wars in a back-and-forth battle centered around the cradle of civilization in Mesopotamia. Even today, Islam finds itself at odds with Christianity, Judaism, and Hinduism, among others. By 1561 Cain had surfaced in Germany and was hiding among the people there. The Federation finally made a detailed scan of Earth's surface and detected his Water of Life Grail. They then assumed that the Asgard must have had an agent on the surface and that had been strictly forbidden. They drew the line and decided to be sure no Asgard influence could unfold, so they decided to purge the town Cain was hiding in to make an example, and that town was modern Nuremberg. El had been monitoring the Federation's activity and alerted the Asgard. When El returned, the Asgard had reactivated a mothership from the Star Wars that had been the same design as the Celestia, called the Asgardia. They took the Asgardia, which could alter its material dimensional frequency, and flew it through the Earth's surface and emerged over Europe. El flew to the surface himself in his old armor and attempted to retrieve Cain. However, by the time he arrived, the Federation's forces were already being engaged by the Asgard's forces above the town, and Cain was gone. He had left the Grail, however, but El was then confronted by one of the Greys for the first time. Using time manipulation technology, they moved faster than what is natural to get the Grail before El, and he tried to fight them. The being managed to escape with the Grail but had revealed to El that there were now other parties also meddling on Earth, likely on behalf of Ra. El then decided to avoid more infighting and finally took direct control over the Federation, eliminating Marduk. El then replaced Marduk with Ashtar to serve as head of the government while El returned to Earth. From there, they had believed Cain was now mortal and would die within centuries, and Ra now had no more power from the Federation. It was at that time that eldest L from the future called up volunteers from various Federation worlds to undergo a transformation using the quantum wave field technology to be reborn on Earth. This process resulted in millions being added to the global population over the last 300 years or so of people referred to as starseeds, who also had already lived on other worlds for millennia, and will return to that existence upon completing their life on Earth, which is a tiny amount of time by comparison. The star people living on Earth are to help offset the effect of Ra and other transhumanist parties, and guarantee that human development could not be completely sabotaged or stagnated. This allowed eldest L to begin the final stage of defeating Ra's influence. L then returned to our solar system and brought Elysium to the planet Jupiter, and established a controlled region of calmed atmospheric conditions to set the city afloat within. The city would sit atop a sea of tranquil cloud cover at the center of the eye of calm air that displaced the violent winds of the upper atmosphere. This area became known as the Eye of Jupiter. From there L could observe Earth, and the city could be at Earth within only seconds if necessary. It was around that time that the elusive group known as the Greys came to Earth and built several subterranean bases, and went to work influencing for Ra. They were a group of people that embraced extreme transhumanism and had evolved over the many thousands of years after the Star Wars in a remote region at the edge of charted space. They steered their own evolution to move away from normal human development and had turned to cloning to maintain their species. They had become cybernetic and partially synthetic, and were trying to abandon biological existence completely. However, they realized that this had removed them from being retrieved by the afterlife system and they could no longer enter the afterlife. They heard Ra had controlled the afterlife and hoped he would help them restore themselves or grant them a form of immortality. It took thousands of years for word of Ra's return to reach those areas, and eventually some decided to travel to Earth to offer their assistance to Ra. By the time they arrived, Ra had already been long driven from control of Earth. They then established themselves in a system relatively close to Earth's in terms of universal distances, in what was eventually discovered to be the Zeta Reticuli system. When they came to Earth's solar system, they found some of the Dracos who had remained in hiding on Mars after the last battle at Cydonia, and joined forces with them to begin preparations for the possibility of attacking Earth and the outbreak of civil war within the Federation. The Greys and Dracos created a lingering threat, and Ra's spirit threatened to unleash them and a wave of devastation on Earth unless the Asgard remained inside Agartha, and some parties within the Federation refused to change their stance towards Earth. The Federation demanded the non-interference quarantine remain in effect in order to appease Ra and avoid a massive attack on Earth. The Cube mothership demanded all parties stay away from Earth and that the Asgard remain inside Agartha. Although L could take control of the mothership, he refrained and let them observe for the time being. Because of this, the Asgard were mostly cut off from the outside world, and L was not totally safe from Ra sympathizers within the Federation. In order to communicate without causing Ra to retaliate, L, the Asgard and the humans in their care, and the anti-Ra resistance among people on the surface made use of subspatial connections to what is now in modern times called Stonehenge, which centered around an ancient Agarthan transportation stone system. That location was built along a ley line and harnesses some of its power from the Earth's electromagnetic field energy and allows for making use of the junction point by those parties, who leave pictograms and graphic formations on the ground using plant life as a medium. It is a form of subtle indirect communication between parties that technically did not violate Ra's demands, as it took his forces some time to even learn about the phenomena. However, this allowed them to communicate in code and avoid drawing a backlash from Ra's Greys or Dracos. Even today the crop circle formation system is in use between these parties. Years later, in 1922, Akhenaten was finally set free by a team that was actually employed by Cain, who had been searching for another Grail. When Akhenaten emerged, he had killed the last of his slaves and had been barely able to survive in a highly degraded state, having had almost no light for almost 4 millennia. He killed most of the party to consume them, but Cain convinced him to join forces and help each other out. They returned to Europe and went to work making use of Cain's resources to build up a new movement, which became known to the world as the Nazis under Adolf Hitler. Hitler's symbol for his movement, the swastika, had been a rehash of the mark of Cain, that Adamu had given Cain after bringing him under control at the end of his rebellion almost 6,000 years ago. This is when the Greys and some Dracos joined Akhenaten and Cain on the surface and went to work helping the Nazi regime build up its forces quickly, and provided them many technological advantages. In other ways, they simply dumped massive amounts of resources on them, allowing them to build large numbers of U-boats and aircraft in just a few years. Meanwhile, El also built up the West's forces. He figured out what was going on, and this time, under control of the Federation, made it clear that any overt action by the Greys would be met with severe consequences. On several occasions the Greys came close to attacking Allied air fleets bombing Germany, and the Federation in many cases flew their Firefly fighters in escort of the bombers to ensure no overt attack came. When it became clear the war was lost, Hitler was expected to order Germany to fight to the last man, but the humans that stayed with the Agarthens volunteered to negotiate, and offered Hitler and 2,000 people amnesty within their city if they surrendered and left the surface, agreeing never to attempt to return. Hitler accepted and fled Berlin via an underground passage that was created temporarily. After that the Nazi regime crumbled and the Greys, with Akhenaten and Dracos, withdrew back into hiding. In 1946, one last Nazi base in Antarctica was discovered that had been built by the assistance of the Greys. They had actually discovered an ancient hidden wormhole point near the South Pole that led to Agartha. They ordered one final attack using their Nazi soldiers remaining there to try to penetrate into Agartha again. This time they briefly succeeded, and they sent several battalions into Agartha, who attacked the city of Shangri-La, and were hoping to liberate Hitler. The Greys themselves used their saucer ships directly in the attack, hoping to quickly take control of the Agarthan jump gate while Nazi troops led by some Dracos seized the city. This time, El and the Asgard responded in force, and a battle unfolded similar in scale to the ancient Star Wars for the first time in millennia. The attack was repelled quickly, and El turned his troops against the Nazi base, destroying it. Cain, who after escaping Europe had fled to the base, was killed by Akhenaten as he escaped with the Greys, as El and his troops stormed the base. El knew it was not over, and began building special forces within Allied militaries to prepare to fight the Greys openly if necessary. By 1947, they created a special branch of government called Majestic 12 to deal with the standoff. In July 1947, the Greys were scouting U.S. military installations in the New Mexico and Nevada desert when they struck a stealth probe. The probe was being developed by the U.S. military with the help of the Federation, and a Venusian named Valiant Thor, who had escaped from a society living in controlled cities on Venus similar to the Agarthens that had sided with the Ra worshippers within the Federation during the war years. The Greys had not expected to encounter such technology, and were caught off guard. The event shifted the war as it finally allowed El's forces to examine them and their technology in great detail. All throughout the years after El revealed himself to the Federation, Ra worship persisted, and many societies responded by declaring their loyalty to Ra instead of El, and the galaxies split in principle. However, it did not lead to open war, but tensions rose another level, as some societies had essentially declared that they would ignore El's authority and possibly band together against him. Fortunately, El's formidable presence and strengthened supporters projected a strong umbrella that finally began to keep the Ra loyalists in check, and those who supported El could now operate with the full weight of Galactic Federation resources. After that, the Greys broadcast threats to invade Earth with a fleet of ships, what we called flying saucers, to devastate Earth, if the Federation didn't pull back from the situation. The standoff continued for years. Eisenhower himself hosted negotiations several times at Tulsa, New Mexico between the Asgard, El, and the Greys, which were futile. After that, the Greys maintained a threat of attack while they operated in secret from underground bases on Earth, the Moon, and Mars. In those years there was a surge in alien and UFO mania, beginning an era within pop culture that included secret propaganda films pertaining to alien invasion and alien threats. These films were to keep the public subconsciously prepped for the possibility of an open attack by the Greys or anyone within the outer worlds that may have sided with Ra. There was also a lingering threat from reptilian infiltration by spies in disguise and android infiltration by advanced human replicant androids, which could be produced by a number of parties throughout the Federation. From the end of the 40s, El seized upon his advantage now that the Nazis were defeated and their attempts to destroy his bloodlines within the Hebrews of Europe were thwarted. In response, El used Western assets to create the modern state of Israel in the Levant, fulfilling the prophesied return of Israel, and solidifying a homeland for the Jews to return to. This was all part of El's plan to return the kingdom of Zion to earth, as it technically connects to Elder El's foundation of Zion in the past. However, now that the return of Zion has begun, Ra's loyal states within Islam have been radicalized and turned into a human wall that then went to work attempting to cancel out and destroy Israel. They have attempted to overwrite Zion's return with an alternate anti-Zion that would change the timeline in Ra's favor if allowed to succeed. El has put all of the resources of his efforts into maintaining Israel, as its existence now centers around the war of influence on Earth of the modern day. In response, Ra's forces have concentrated their efforts on keeping Israel as contained as they possibly can. El's plan always had openly been to defeat Ra's influence once and for all and bring about the return of Zion in the modern day, allowing for his return to Earth and an amalgamation of the timelines for the next age. During the rest of the Cold War, and the era of mutually assured destruction, the Asgard and humans in Shambhala had decided that before any cataclysm could take place, that they should be prepared to quickly take in as many humans as they could to preserve, in the event that Ra succeeded in destroying Earth, so they could start again in the future. Ra warned them in return that if they had attempted to take any of the African races or Hebrews from Israel, Ra would retaliate via his power from the afterlife system and attempt to turn them into remote-controlled zombies. During this time, El and parties within the Asgard knew that they were now in the final phase of completing a causality loop in time, and that they now had to prepare to take in the 144,000 chosen survivors. This would lead them on their path to escape into the past and become the founders of the Federation, the Novans. Most of the humans from Shambhala and the Resistance were still not aware of the time loop that had been caused by a previous timeline, and that was now part of the cycle. But due to Ra's threats, some peoples had to be left to remain and would be dealt with after the loop was completed by the returned El who had fought in the Star Wars. Years passed, and Akhenaten had moved to America, where he established a new secret network within the US military to start a new breakaway society. By the 1960s, Akhenaten had taken control of NASA and much of the US military's space programs. They faked the Apollo missions to placate the population and keep humanity contained on Earth while believing things were progressing normally. In truth, by that time, the Greys, and some of the Nazis they took with them, had established a base complex on the Moon, and had begun cloning soldiers from the Nazi soldiers they had brought with them. Akhenaten had his forces scour the surface for ancient technology and succeeded in finding an Asgard transportation stone. They hacked the stone and it allowed them to connect to the underground complex at Cydonia, which had been abandoned for almost 6,000 years. Both sides employed secret forces within the US military. El created a special force from people of the era, and they also established their own base on Mars, unaware of the enemy presence beneath Cydonia. It was during the late 1980s and early 90s that several whistleblowers raised awareness of anomalous activity within the military. This exposed to El that the Greys and Dracos were working to control the US military, and he began tracing their connections. This led El to discover their bases on the Moon, Earth, and Mars. El watched carefully and after years of preparations, had his forces attack all of these areas at once. They launched surprise attacks against the base at Cydonia, on the Moon, and complexes beneath New Mexico, Nevada, and California. This ended Akhenaten's Earth-based programs. The Greys and Dracos were majorly defeated, and driven from this solar system. Akhenaten had been planning to use the new dependence on computers back on Earth to take over the world in a single move, but it failed when El discovered he had to act before their deadline of the year 2000, which was their chosen point to stage the takeover and attempt to pass it off to the population as a computer glitch-induced global crisis. When that was averted, Akhenaten continued to hide on the surface and used his last resources to stage a takeover of the United States after orchestrating the 9/11 terrorist attacks. These attacks were arranged by Akhenaten's forces within the government to use the US government's own continuity of government protocols to establish an emergency government that they were already waiting to take control of. The next 8 years under the Bush administration was Akhenaten working through his Ra-worshipping minions in the Skull and Bones Society to take over the Middle East for various purposes, including a plan for a new Ra-worshipping state, and to scour the region for lost ancient technology. Akhenaten then placed himself as president directly under the identity of Barack Obama. During those years they completed the replacement tower at the World Trade Center site that also masked a secret underground construction site for a colony ship. They had been secretly contacted and assisted by Ra worshippers within the Federation, mostly non-human species that feared open rebellion now that El had revealed himself. They assisted in building the ship and prepared to launch to another galaxy at the edge of the known universe if they lost control on Earth. This is the point where the causality loop returns to the start. At that time, psychic knowledge manifested by El told him where changes must be made to their actions to change the outcome of the timeline. He knew to take his youngest self that started on Earth and people from that era and send them into the past, which would be the group that became the Novans. They knew that in an original timeline they had no way to beat Ra and Akhenaten at that time, so they took in many people from the societies of Earth to save them from Ra's destruction, and were given their own technologically advanced city by the original Asgard. After trying to lead Earth against Ra with the Asgard's help, they would have been destroyed, so instead fled into the distant past to fight Ra when his original presence was only beginning. So, they knew to take in people and took in 144,000 to populate a new city, called Home 1. That city was then sent into the past instead of trying to fight Ra's side of the Federation. This upheld the timeline, and forced Ra to have them plan to escape into exile instead. However, El found out about them and they realized they were trapped by him in orbit. So they decided to use their FTL drive as a time machine and make a jump into the distant past, in another attempt to overwrite the entire timeline. El detected their energy buildup and realized what they were doing, and then took measures to protect himself from their action. He could tell by their energy usage how far back they could go, and decided to go back even further. El went back over 4 million years. Akhenaten emerged after El but still managed to elude exactly when, and escaped to seclusion and rebuilt. This led to years more of Star Wars in the distant past. That era's Galactic Federation was reached by El of the distant future, and he took control himself. Once their wars were brought under control, special measures were taken to work those events into the outcome in the future. That El, who was able to fully manipulate time locally, and was immortal, had revealed that all of those who had been dying all throughout every era, were contacted outside of normal time upon death, and asked if they wished to go to the afterlife system dominated by Ra, or be brought to the distant future and kept immortal to join the Federation of that era. The entire time, no one had been lost and all eventually are brought to the distant future. However, there are those who were on Ra's side like Hitler that, post-intervention, are brought to the future Federation to stand trial, before being sent to their ultimate fate. Earth of this time is now going to be developed under guidance in order to compensate for the changes caused by Ra's jumps into the past. Our development connects to the Galactic Federation of the distant future, which in turn is what spawned the entire conflict across time. Now that El and the Federation has undisputed control in all time periods, an overt intervention to free Earth of Ra and the Grey's umbrella is imminent. More information will be released when appropriate. This has been a history of the Star Wars, and the Galactic Federation. Thank you.